Civics and American Government class. How you doing, you little rascals? Let's get back to it. Today we're talking cabinet still, kind of. But as we were talking yesterday about Robert Weaver and Patricia Roberts Harris, the first black cabinet member and the first black female cabinet member, I decided I wanted to take a closer look at some notable firsts in the cabinet. And then, if we have time, we're going to talk about the president pro tempore, the first minority president pro tempore, a guy named Daniel Inouye, and we'll talk about the first female and black Supreme Court justices. There still hasn't been a black female on there, but I'm not sure if we'll have time because there's a lot. There's a lot of writing on these slides. So if you would prefer to read these on your own, feel free to pause the screen and read it yourself. But I urge you to follow along with me, and let's check this out. So who are we talking about today? Well, in order, we're talking about Robert Weaver, the first black cabinet member, Patricia Roberts, the first black female cabinet member, Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member, Hillary Clinton, the first female Secretary of State, Colin Powell, the first black Secretary of State, and Condoleezza Rice, the first black female Secretary of State. If we have time, we'll talk about these guys. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court Justice, and Daniel Inouye, first minority president pro tempore of the Senate. He's an Asian guy from Hawaii. Why do I mention the president pro tempore of the Senate? Because they're so high in the presidential line of succession. So it's a very, very prominent office. It's actually voted on by the Senate at large. They choose a president pro tempore. So it's more, a lot of the day to day is symbolic, but in terms of presidential succession, it's a very prominent position. Robert Weaver. Robert Clifton Weaver was born December 29th, 1907, in Washington, D.C. He went to school at Harvard. He's a very smart guy. He got both his BA and his doctorate. Throughout the New Deal era, Weaver served as an advisor on minority affairs in a number of federal agencies. He began to establish himself during the New Deal era. Weaver remained an active participant in efforts to improve race relations throughout the mid 1940s. Following the Second World War, Weaver was a professor at Northwestern, Columbia, and New York universities from 1947 until 1951. Between 1949 and 1955, he also worked for the John Hay Whitney Foundation, overseeing the Opportunity Fellowship Program. In the late 1950s, Weaver was New York State Rent Commissioner. That's an important position. Then in 1960, he became the vice chairman of the New York City Housing and Redevelopment Board. President elect Kennedy asked Weaver to serve as the administrator of the Housing and Home Finance Agency, the HHFA. In that capacity, Weaver helped author the 1961 compilation housing bill. He also supported and helped lobby for the 1962 Senior Citizens Housing Act. Weaver continued working at the HHFA during the Johnston administration, drafting all of the administration's housing and urban renewal programs. Weaver also worked on the $7.8 billion housing bill in 1965, which included an expansion of public housing and programs for rent supplementing low income families. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, was created in September 1965, and Weaver became its first secretary the following January. That made him the first African American appointed to a cabinet position. And I bet most of us had never heard of his name before this class. Um, HUD absorbed HHFA, so many of Weaver's responsibilities carried over from his former post. After assuming the responsibilities as HUD secretary, Weaver promoted the Metropolitan Development Act in November 1966 and the Demonstration Cities program. Patricia Roberts, first black female cabinet member. Patricia Roberts Harris was born May 31st, 1924, in Mattoon, Illinois, and earned a bachelor's degree in political science and economics in 1945 from Howard University. Following her undergraduate studies, Harris worked for the Chicago Young Women's Christian Association. She also became assistant director of the American Council for Human Rights and executive director of Delta Sigma Theta. She then earned a law degree and worked for the U.S. Department of Justice's Criminal Division. After that, Harris was a member of the Howard University Law School faculty from 1961 to 1965 and 67 to 70. In the interim, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed her ambassador to Luxembourg. Following her time at Howard, Harris practiced law privately for several years. And then in the Carter administration, Georgia's very own, Harris served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare, and then Secretary of Health and Human Services. Patricia Harris died March 23rd, 1985. Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member. She was born in 1882 in Boston, Massachusetts. Frances Perkins studied sociology and economics at Mount Holyoke College and continued her education at the University of Chicago and at UPenn and Columbia University, earning a master's degree in 1913. While still in school, Perkins became involved in social work and entered the political arena to become a more effective spokeswoman for her cause. She was a member of the New York Industrial Commission, director of the Council of Immigrant Education, and a member of the State Industrial Board, becoming chairwoman in 1926. Under then Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, Perkins was head of the New York State Department of Labor from 1929 to 1933. When Roosevelt became president, he tapped Perkins to become Secretary of Labor, making her the first woman to hold a cabinet post. Perkins would serve in that capacity from 1933 to 1945. She was also chair of the Committee on Economic Security. Perkins later became a member of the Federal Civil Service Commission under President Harry S. Truman. After leaving government, she was affiliated with Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations as a lecturer on labor issues. She published The Roosevelt I Knew and was inducted into the Labor Hall of Fame in 1988. She died May 14th, 1965 in New York. Hillary Clinton, the first female Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton was the first female Secretary of State. That's a name all of you guys know because even though she's not in a political position, like she doesn't work for the government, her name still comes up a whole lot. The current administration does not think very highly of Hillary Clinton, nor do the current president's supporters. So a lot of times she's portrayed by her critics as being a villain of some kind. Raised in the Chicago suburb of Park Ridge, Clinton graduated from Wellesley College in 1969 and earned a JD from Yale Law School in 1973. After serving as a congressional legal counsel, she moved to Arkansas and married future President Bill Clinton in 1975. The two met at Yale. In 1977, she co founded Arkansas Advocates for Children and Family. She was appointed the first female chair of the Legal Services Corporation in 1978 and became the first female partner at Little Rock's Rose Law Firm the following year. Clinton was the First Lady of Arkansas from 1979 to 1981 and again from 1983 to 1992. In 2000, Clinton was elected as the first female senator from New York. She was reelected in 2006. During her Senate tenure, Clinton had advocated for medical benefits for first responders whose health was damaged in the September 11th attacks. In 2008, Clinton ran for president but was defeated by eventual winner Barack Obama in the Democratic primaries. Clinton was U.S. Secretary of State in the Obama administration from 2009 to 2013. During her tenure, Clinton responded to the Arab Spring by advocating military intervention in Libya. She was harshly criticized by Republicans for the failure to prevent or adequately respond to the 2012 Benghazi attack. Clinton helped to organize a diplomatic isolation and a regime of international sanctions against Iran in an effort to force it to curtail its nuclear program. This effort eventually led to the multinational Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action Agreement in 2015. So her involvement in all of that, Benghazi specifically, that really followed her. That was a stain on her record that she really couldn't overcome. Her use of a private email server during her time as Secretary of State was the subject of intense scrutiny. While no charges were filed against Clinton, the email controversy was the single most covered topic during the 2016 presidential election. Colin Powell. And when I was in seventh grade, I had the privilege of hearing a Secretary of State speak at a school assembly. My school in Atlanta brought in Colin Powell, but I really was too young to appreciate what an opportunity that was. But anyway, enough about me. Colin Powell was the nation's first African American Secretary of State, and he was born in Harlem to Jamaican immigrants in 1937. He earned his bachelor's degree in geology from the City College of New York in 1958. During his undergraduate studies, Powell joined the College Reserves Officer Training Corps, ROTC, leading the precision drill team and rising to the highest possible rank, Cadet Colonel. Through ROTC, Powell earned a postgraduate commission as second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. He served first in West Germany and then did 2 tours in Vietnam, where he was twice wounded. From 1979 to 1981, Powell worked in the Carter administration as an executive assistant to the Secretary of Energy and as senior military assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. That's a mouthful. In 1989, Powell was named chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a position in which he exercised substantial influence over the course of the Gulf War. He retired from the military in 1993. In nominating Powell as Secretary of State, President George W. Bush plucked Powell from America's promise. President Bush plucked Powell from America's Promise, a foundation that directs its resources towards helping the nation's young people. Colin Powell announced his resignation after the 2004 election. Bush nominated Condoleezza Rice to succeed him. Rice was confirmed by the Senate on January 26, 2005. Speaking of Condoleezza Rice, sorry guys. Condoleezza Rice, like we just said, she was the successor to Colin Powell. Condoleezza Rice was born in 1954 in Birmingham, Alabama. She earned a BA in political science with honors from the University of Denver in 1974, a master's in political science from the University of Notre Dame in 1975, and a PhD in political science from the University of Denver Graduate School of International Studies in 1981. Think about the fact that she was born in 1954 in Birmingham, Alabama. That means she would have been a kid when all the bombings and riots were going off in Birmingham. That's to grow up seeing that, and then to rise to her ranks in the government. That's pretty remarkable. Whether you like or don't like her politics. From 1981 to 1999, Rice served as a fellow in the Arms Control and Disarmament Program and as a tenured professor in the Political Science Department at Stanford University. At the same time, she worked with the Council on Foreign Relations as part of the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. From 1989 to 1991, Rice served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Soviet and East European Affairs for President George H.W. Bush at the National Security Council. In 1993, she became Provost of Stanford University, a post she held until 1999. In 2000, Rice served as Foreign Policy Advisor for the George W. Bush presidential campaign. A prolific author and member of numerous boards of directors and organizations, Condoleezza Rice entered the Bush administration in 2001 as Assistant to President for National Security, a position commonly known as National Security Advisor. In November 2004, President Bush nominated Rice to succeed Colin Powell as Secretary of State, and she was confirmed by the Senate. January 26, 2005. We made it in time for the bonus peeps: Sandra Day O'Connor, Thurgood Marshall, and Daniel Inouye. Not cabinet members, but still notable politicians. Oh, well, I suppose Supreme Court justices, I don't know if you'd call them a politician. Probably not. But notable positions within the government, no doubt about it. So, first, let's look at Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is a long article, so we're not going to read the whole thing. It goes on and talks about her life after the Supreme Court and challenges that she faced later in life. But I'll let you guys look that up if you want. I would love for you to uh, find out more about these guys. Who is Sandra Day O'Connor? Sandra Day O'Connor was elected 2 terms in the Arizona State Senate. In 1981, Ronald Reagan nominated her to the U.S. Supreme Court. She received unanimous Senate approval and made history as the first woman justice to serve on the nation's highest court. O'Connor was a key swing vote in many important cases, including the upholding of Roe v. Wade. She retired in 2006 after serving 34 years. Born March 26, 1930 in El Paso, Texas, O'Connor spent part of her youth in her family's Arizona ranch. She was adept at riding and assisted with ranch duties. She later wrote about her rough and tumble childhood in her memoir. After graduating from Stanford University in 1950 with a bachelor's degree in economics, O'Connor attended the university's law school and received her degree in 1952, graduating third in her class. In 1969, O'Connor received a state Senate appointment by Governor Jack Williams to fill a vacancy. A conservative Republican, O'Connor won re-election twice. In 1974, she took on a different challenge and ran for the position of judge in the Maricopa County Superior Court, winning the race. As a judge, O'Connor developed a solid reputation for being firm but just. Outside the courtroom, she remained involved in Republican politics. In 1979, O'Connor was selected to serve on the state's Court of Appeals. Only 2 years later, President Ronald Reagan nominated her for Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. O'Connor received unanimous approval from the U.S. Senate and broke new ground for women when she was sworn in as the first female justice on the Supreme Court. So we talked Sandra Day. Now let's talk the first black Supreme Court justice is a man named Thurgood Marshall. Um, we're going to watch a clip of this, which I really like. United States courts.
Thurgood Marshall, the civil rights crusader, a man who was instrumental in ending legal segregation and later became the first African American justice of the Supreme Court. In this special series we call Moments in History, we remember a man who challenged our legal system to create a more perfect union and forever change our country. Thurgood Marshall was born in 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland. His mother, an educator, and father, a railroad porter, steered Marshall into a law career. After graduating with honors from Lincoln University, Marshall applied to the University of Maryland Law School, but was denied because he was African American. So he traveled for an hour daily to Howard University Law School under the tutelage of a prominent NAACP attorney, Charles Hamilton Houston. One of the suggestions made to Thurgood Marshall by Charles Hamilton Houston was to go to the deepest South, into those pockets of the country where resistance against equality and desegregation were the toughest, and pay attention to the people, listen to them, hear their stories, and understand that you are working for a cause that's bigger than being a lawyer, bigger than being a law graduate, bigger than even anything you can imagine in your life. And Thurgood Marshall took on that mantle. In 1934, Marshall graduated magna cum laude from Howard. The following year, he started a private practice and eventually succeeds his mentor, Charles Houston, to become the NAACP's chief counsel. During this time, Marshall systematically dismantles the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson ruling that upheld racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. He argued 32 civil rights cases before the Supreme Court, winning 29.
He wanted to establish the building blocks of earlier cases. He didn't want this issue to come up early in the litigation. And I learned a lot about how a person can try to influence the development of an issue over a long period of time.
In fact, it was 13 years before Marshall had a chance to challenge separate but equal with the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. The ruling ended segregation in the U.S. By now, Thurgood Marshall is a household name, but not everyone is in favor of the landmark decision.
It took an enormous amount of guts. He told us the story about how he'd have to move sometimes 2 or 3 times a night from home to home in order to stay safe. He told us the story about how he was very close to being lynched one time. It wasn't just his client, it was he who was in danger.
Justice Marshall was a great admirer of the man I wound up working for, Judge Harold Tyler. And Tyler had been an assistant attorney general in charge of civil rights. One day in the fall of 1960, Marshall was down in New Orleans and was advised that the Klan was coming to get him that very night. He called Tyler. He had Tyler's phone number.
I'll pause this, guys, and end the lesson, but I'll post this up. I encourage you to watch the rest of it. It's really good. So your lesson posted right here, week 4-2 lesson. Then you have an analysis assignment, which is just, I believe, 5, maybe 6 questions about the presentation. So good job. I'll talk to y'all tomorrow.